He brewed coffee outside Stanford, but what percolated in his mind was a new way to bend time. California morning, the corner just outside Stanford gates was familiar with the brisk footsteps of students and professors. Amid the quiet rush, one figure stood apart, a lean, brown-skinned boy carefully assembling a small coffee cart. The cart was nothing fancy. A folding table, two large thermal dispensers, a small camping stove, and a handwritten sign, Café del Tiempo, $200. Luis, 17, the son of a Guatemalan immigrant, had spent his childhood among the strawberry fields of Watsonville. His hands, though young, were worn like those of a farmer twice his age. Before dawn, he would gently help his mother, Elena, into her chair near the window, leaving a small thermos of herbal tea beside her pills. When she was first diagnosed with cancer, the doctors had said they caught it late. The treatments were harsh, but her smile never faded. When her hair began to fall, Luis would braid what remained gently, saying, "You still look like the stars, Mommy." Her response was always the same. "And you, mijijo, are my little physicist." He made a quiet vow. Drop out of high school and sell coffee in the early mornings to pay for her chemo, scans, and pills. No one asked why he wasn't in class. Luis never invited sympathy, only offered warmth in a cup. None of his customers knew that. They only knew of the boy who smiled gently, brewed rich coffee with cinnamon, and spent long pauses scribbling in a weathered notebook. He observed the changing light with the care of a clockmaker, tracking where each shadow pointed as the sun moved across the sky. Within those pages were ideas most undergrads dared not touch. Luis was documenting his observations of shadow movement and modeling them against Minkowski spacetime. He suspected that shadows, seemingly mundane, were natural projections of time dilation due to Earth's motion. The way tree shadows stretched at 6 a.m. versus 8 a.m. could reflect divergence on the t and x-axes. Each morning he marked the position of the cart's shadow, the trees, and even his own. A pattern was forming. Luis didn't learn from textbooks. He studied through online lectures, especially MIT OpenCourseWare. At night, by the flickering light of a second-hand tablet, he watched Walter Lewin swing pendulums, fire projectiles, and speak about the poetry of motion. But nothing captured his obsession like the twin paradox. In that paradox, one twin stays on Earth while the other travels through space and returns younger. Luis wondered, can we see this with our own eyes? If I move along the x-axis, does the shadow change like a natural clock? What if time isn't just a dimension but a fabric that reacts to light and motion? One warm morning, as he poured the first batch of dark roast, an older man paused in front of the cart. Gray hair, leather briefcase, eyes focused not on the coffee, but on the notebook. "Are you sketching light cones?" he asked in a calm, gravelly voice. Luis hesitated, eyes bright. "I think if a tree's shadow shifts with the sun, that's a 2D light cone. The intersection of two shadows is the shared space-time of two movements." The man smiled gently. He was Dr. Raymond Bell, a theoretical physicist at Stanford, 25 years in. A peer of Kip Thorne, co-author on early wormhole models. He sat slowly on the nearby bench, pointing to a Lorentz transformation written in pencil. "Do you realize this means time isn't linear?" Luis nodded, voice soft. "I think time has shape, like shadows, like the swirl in coffee. If we turn, the shape changes." Dr. Bell fell silent. In Luis, he saw something rare. Mathematical intuition drawn from nature. He had taught hundreds of students, many with perfect test scores, but few who could see physics breathing in the trees. After a pause, the professor stood, placing a crisp bill on the counter, refusing the cup. "I'll be back tomorrow. Brew me one more cup, and diagram your time curve for me." Luis watched him walk away, heart pounding. Not because of Stanford, not even his mother's illness, but because, for the first time, someone had opened a door. That night, Luis stayed up past midnight. He took his string, flashlight, and graph paper, marking lines of projected light from various angles. He recreated the geometry of shadow movement in his backyard, holding a flashlight like the sun and placing stones as trees. He labeled axes, traced hyperbolas, and whispered equations like prayers. His mother stirred once. "Studying again, mijijo?" "Yes, mommy," he whispered, wrapping her in a blanket. "Just chasing light." The next morning, the cart smelled of cinnamon and hope. A small drawing was taped to the side, a cone drawn from a shadow, annotated with space-time coordinates. Stanford students passed by oblivious, but Luis stood taller that morning, not because he was seen, but because the universe, for a moment, had answered back. And so began a story of time, light, and a soul forged in silence. Luis arrived at the cart earlier than usual. The sky was still a deep blue, the kind of hue only visible before dawn fully breaks. He had cleaned the copper kettle twice, lined up the sugar packets like tiny soldiers, and even ironed his shirt the night before, a rarity for someone who often wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. He was nervous. Dr. Bell had said he would return, but promises from professors carried the weight of the wind. Luis had seen students cry outside lecture halls, heard stories of dreams deferred by one dismissive comment. He wondered, had he imagined the whole thing? Perhaps the man had been polite, intrigued for a moment, but ultimately dismissive. But when the church bell struck 6:30 a.m., there he was. "Good morning," Dr. Bell greeted, eyeing the cart with mild curiosity. Luis handed him a steaming cup. "I brewed this with the same timing as yesterday. 4 minutes. Constant temperature. I hope it tastes the same." "Consistency is the soul of good science," Bell said, taking a careful sip. He sat again on the same bench, this time placing his leather briefcase beside him with care. Luis pulled out the diagram he had drawn the night before. It was larger now, with additional annotations, world lines, tangent vectors, and references to Lorentz intervals. Bell leaned in, studying it. "This," he said slowly, "is more than just clever. You're trying to represent time as visible curvature in shadow paths. You realize the philosophical implications of that?" Luis shrugged. "I just wanted to see if time could cast a shadow." Bell looked at him for a long moment, then leaned back. "Tell me about your education." "I dropped out, but I audit courses online, Feynman lectures, MIT OCW. I watch physics talks while roasting beans." "And your mathematics?" "I solved up to differential equations on Khan Academy, then started learning tensor calculus on my own. Slowly. I work better when I write things down." Bell nodded thoughtfully. "Most of my graduate students can't define a proper light cone. You just sketched one with chalk and sunlight." They sat in silence. Only the sound of distant bike chains and the rustle of eucalyptus leaves filled the air. Then Bell asked, "Why shadows?" Luis paused. "Because light is the one constant. Everything else lies to you, but not light. And a shadow is light's imprint. It tells you what stood in its path and when." The professor smiled, then took out a small notepad and jotted something down. "You have the intuition of a poet, but we need to test these ideas. build them on mathematical rigor. Luis felt a flicker of doubt. But I don't have the words. Or the access. You have me, Bell said simply. If you're willing to work, I'll meet you here every morning. We'll go through the math together. We'll challenge your assumptions. We'll prove or disprove your theorem. Luis swallowed hard. But why me? Dr. Bell looked away. Because my own son once asked me what time was, and I didn't have the courage to answer. The silence returned, this time heavier. Then Bell stood. Same time tomorrow. Bring your notebook. Bring your light. Luis watched the professor walk away, the morning sun casting a long shadow behind him. A moving shadow. A trace in time. That night, Luis opened a fresh page in his notebook. At the top, he wrote, The Coffee Cart Theorem, Draft 1. Below it, Hypothesis. The trajectory of a shadow across a fixed plane encodes relativistic time dilation. The next day began the same. Bell arrived, this time with 2 books under his arm. A well-worn copy of Gravitation by Meisner, Thorne, and Wheeler, and a thinner notebook marked with Greek letters. We start with the basics, he said. Show me your understanding of the Lorentz transformation. Luis opened his notebook and began writing. X equals gamma x vt t e's gamma t vx ci2. Where gamma equals, Luis replied without hesitation. Gamma equals 1 sqrt 1 vx2 cl2. Bell smiled. Good. Now apply it to a photon moving along the x-axis. They worked through equations, checking units, drawing spacetime diagrams. Passers-by gave them odd glances. A professor and a coffee vendor bent over equations in the middle of a sidewalk. But neither of them noticed. Days passed. Each morning became a classroom. Bell pushed harder. If your shadow curve is correct, he said one morning, you should be able to describe the derivative of the shadow's position as a function of observer speed. Luis paused. You mean I should take dx shadow, dv observer? Exactly. That slope would represent how time dilation manifests visually. It's subtle, but measurable. Luis looked up. But what about the sun's position? It moves too. Wouldn't that add noise to the data? Bell nodded approvingly. You're already thinking like a physicist. Yes, we'll need to isolate variables. Control for solar position, maybe run the experiment indoors with controlled lighting later. On the 7th day, Bell brought a small, old digital camera. Let's document. Build evidence. They took photos every 5 minutes. Luis made meticulous notes. They plotted graphs, adjusted for angles. Patterns began to emerge. But Luis also began to notice something else. Bell was weary. There were mornings he coughed hard, brushed it off. His hands sometimes trembled. One morning, Luis asked, "Are you okay?" Bell waved it away. We all age. That's why time matters. The answer sounded rehearsed. That night, Luis stayed up late again. He revised his notes, organized the images, and began writing a small draft of what might become a paper. It was rough, but it had structure. He titled it, Empirical Visualization of Lorentz Dilation via Shadow Trajectory. At the bottom of the page, he wrote, With gratitude to R.B. 2 weeks had passed since their first meeting. Luis no longer flinched when asked to differentiate a function. He had learned to sketch world lines by instinct. Bell, too, had softened. There were moments he would just sit quietly, watching the light move across the ground, as if seeing it for the first time. One morning, Bell didn't come. Luis waited until 8 a.m. No sign. He served coffee as usual, but barely spoke. That night, he worried. The next day, Bell returned, walking more slowly. "Hospital," he admitted quietly. "Old lungs. Nothing new." Luis said nothing, only handed him a warm cup. They sat for a long time without speaking. Bell finally said, "This theorem, it might be your legacy, but it might also be mine." Luis frowned. "I don't want it to be about legacy. I just want to understand." Bell smiled. "That's why it's worth passing on." That evening, Bell handed Luis a key. "My office, room 318, physics building. Go there. You'll find notes, books. Use what you need. You're ready." Luis accepted it with trembling hands. Back home, he showed the key to his mother. She touched it gently. "Doors open, mijo. But you must walk through." Luis stared at the stars that night, thinking of shadows, of equations, of how much one moment, one teacher, could change the trajectory of a life. Chapter 2. Closed with no grand applause, only quiet resolve. The coffee cart remained. The morning air cooled. But something invisible had begun to accelerate. Time itself seemed to bend around the boy who had dared to trace it with light. The morning light was different now. Luis had learned to see it not just as brightness or warmth, but as a language, a slow, silent syntax of angles and motion. Each tree's shadow, each rooftop's contour, told a story of time in motion. With Dr. Bell's encouragement, Luis began building a full-scale diagram on a long roll of butcher paper he found discarded behind a grocery store. He pinned it to a wood board behind the cart, careful to align it with true north. On it, he mapped the trajectory of shadows cast by a nearby lamppost at intervals throughout the day. He plotted X and T, time in minutes on the vertical axis, distance in centimeters across the horizontal. With each point marked and remeasured, he began to see a shape emerge. A soft curve bending with the sun's path, like a fingerprint pressed into spacetime. One morning, a janitor paused on his way to the engineering building. "What is all this?" Luis handed him a warm cup of coffee and replied, "It's a map of how time moves." The janitor blinked. "I thought time moved straight." "Only if you're not paying attention," Luis said with a shy smile. By the end of the week, Bell had reviewed Luis's growing set of diagrams. The professor nodded appreciatively. "You're visualizing a Lorentz contraction using shadows. That curve, it's your light cone projection on a two-dimensional surface. It's beautiful." Luis beamed. "I think if I can explain this right, even my mom could understand relativity." Bell paused. "Then you should teach it." Luis froze. "Teach? Me? Why not? I'll invite a few of my students to stop by. They won't expect much, which is exactly why they'll learn something." That Friday, Bell returned with 3 undergraduates in tow, curious, slightly amused. They approached the cart with a mix of skepticism and boredom, but Bell simply gestured to Luis and said, "Watch." Luis took a deep breath. "Okay, imagine this pole as a world line. Every 5 minutes, its shadow moves, but not in a straight line. It bends. That bend, it's telling you that light doesn't just travel, it transforms perspective. Now, if you're moving." He paused, picked up a small mirror and flashlight from under the cart. "If you walk with the light, the shadow changes slower. If you walk against it, it changes faster. This is visual time dilation." One student, a girl in physics honors, leaned in. You're describing frame-dependent temporal variance in shadows. That actually makes sense. Luis smiled. It's the same math, just drawn on the sidewalk. By the end of the demonstration, the students were asking questions. Luis answered some, deferred others to Bell, but his voice had changed. It carried more weight. Later, Bell leaned close. You taught them. In one morning, you did what textbooks couldn't. Luis flushed. I just translated it into light. They began refining the method. Bell suggested using translucent paper to layer shadow data over time. Luis built a small rig out of cardboard and wire hangers, allowing sunlight to pass through slits at specific intervals. They documented not just shadow lengths, but angles, rates of curvature. The data started to align. Luis labeled it empirical Lorentz projection via terrestrial light. It was raw, beautiful, and honest. Word spread slowly. A graduate TA from the astrophysics department showed up, then a doctoral student in applied mathematics. Each morning, a few more lingered around the cart, not for coffee, but for insight. Luis never pretended to be an expert. He simply pointed to the paper, the curve, the light. This is what time looks like when you stop assuming it's invisible. He added a journal next to the cart, titled Light Log. Visitors were invited to write reflections, observations, or questions. Some scribbled equations. Others wrote poetry. One elderly man simply wrote, I lost my wife 3 years ago. Today, your shadow made me feel her again. One day, a middle-aged woman approached shyly. My daughter wants to be a physicist, but we can't afford tutors. Would you mind talking to her? Luis bent down to meet the girl's eyes. She looked about 10, clutching a drawing of stars. Do you know what a photon is? He asked gently. She nodded. Good. That's all you need to begin. From then on, Luis hosted informal shadow sessions every Saturday morning. Using simple language and sidewalk chalk, he showed children how time and light danced together. Bell watched from the bench, sometimes correcting, mostly smiling. It was on one of those Saturdays that Bell introduced Luis to someone unexpected, Dr. Eileen Voss, chair of Stanford's physics department. Raymond says you found a new way to teach relativity, she said, scanning the diagrams, and that you're mapping space-time using shadows? Luis nodded, heart pounding. She looked him over, impressed but curious. And where did you learn all this? Luis pointed to the notebook. Mostly here. And there. He gestured toward the sun. She stayed an hour, asked sharp questions. At the end, she handed Luis her card. We have a summer seminar for independent researchers. No credentials required. Apply. I'll vouch for you. Bell said nothing until she was gone. Then simply, you earned that. That night, Luis sat on the rooftop of their small apartment. His mother was asleep inside, weak but peaceful. He looked at the stars, not as distant, not as cold. He traced a shadow with his finger on the rooftop. Time was not just something to measure, it was something to share. And now, he had the language to do so. For the first time in his life, Luis stepped into the Cecil H. Green Library. It was quiet in the way only grand old libraries could be, where dust carried memory and silence felt sacred. Dr. Bell had arranged a visitor pass, his name handwritten on a yellow card clipped to his collar. He moved slowly between shelves, reading names like Landau, Wheeler, Weinberg. So many voices, all speaking from the past, waiting to be heard. Luis ran his fingers across the spine of a thick volume titled Relativity, the Special and the General Theory. Bell waited by the circulation desk, watching. Take your time, he said. Luis whispered, "It smells like my mother's old books, like something still alive." He found a seat near the window, a forgotten alcove with morning light spilling across the desk. The panes were slightly dusty, but through them he could see the main quad. From this vantage, the world looked paused, like it was waiting to be understood. He opened a journal from the 1970s, published by the Physical Review. The article was titled, "Time Synchronization and Relativistic Motion in Terrestrial Frames." The math was dense. Lorentz matrices, transformations in non-inertial frames, references to Haffel-Keating experiments. But one diagram, simple, a triangle of motion, caught his eye. Luis stared, then frowned. The angle was off. At first he thought it was a misprint, but the units didn't align. The article assumed the Earth's rotation as constant across longitudinal bands, but hadn't corrected for elevation variance. A small oversight, insignificant to most. But it shifted the reference frame just enough to misplace the geodesic. Luis pulled out a blank page and began redrawing the projection. He modeled it using a local frame transformation, essentially embedding each observer within a curved light cone that adjusted per elevation. When he finished, the path realigned. Not perfectly, but closer, much closer. Bell approached behind him. "You've been quiet." Luis looked up. "There's an error in this paper. See? They treat all points on the Earth's surface as if they're the same distance from the center. But elevation changes that." Bell leaned in. "You're right. They modeled in spherical coordinates, but didn't adjust the radial distance for elevation. That would skew the local reference frame." Luis nodded. "So I used a local frame projection, mapped it point by point instead of assuming a uniform shell." Bell studied the drawing. His eyes narrowed. "Luis, do you realize what you've done?" Luis blinked. "Just fixed a diagram." "No. You challenged a 40-year-old publication, not with pride but precision. That's what real physicists do." For the first time, Bell looked shaken, not by doubt, but by possibility. He sat beside Luis, silent for a moment, then said, "You could go further than any of us." Luis didn't answer. He looked back out the window. The light had shifted again. The shadow of the window frame now crossed his diagram, like a sundial marking an unseen hour. He traced the line gently. Time moved on. But from this window, Luis had begun to see it differently. Not as a line, but as a landscape waiting to be redrawn. It was a quiet Sunday when Luis found the box. His mother was sleeping, her breathing shallow, but even. He'd spent the morning refilling her prescriptions, preparing tea, and adjusting pillows so the sun could warm her hands. Afterward, in search of an old notebook, Luis reached for a carton tucked under their bed. Inside, beneath old photos and church receipts, lay a small, weathered tin box. He opened it. Dozens of folded papers. Handwriting. Spanish. Faded ink. Luis unfolded one carefully. "Mi querido hijo, hoy volví a soñar con la física. Soñé que el tiempo era un río, y yo aún podía navegarlo." His breath caught. These were letters, not sent to anyone, not even to him. Just thoughts, some dated, some not. In one, his mother described her first physics class at Universidad de San Carlos. In another, she wrote equations in the margins, correcting them mid-thought. She had loved this. Before war came. Before her family was forced to flee. Before the farm work and long shifts in the cannery. Before cancer. Luis read for hours. Each page felt like a signal across time. She hadn't abandoned physics. It had been taken, but not extinguished. One letter ended. If ever you find this, and you still love light the way I did, then continue for us both. Luis wiped his eyes. That night, he stayed up until dawn typing his notes, scanning diagrams, double-checking citations. He restructured his shadow data, labeled all figures, and converted every chalk mark into mathematical notation. He titled the document, The Coffee Cart Theorem, a local frame perspective on shadow-based time dilation. On the last page, he added a quote from one of the letters. Even a shadow can be evidence of light. He emailed it, along with an application, to the upcoming Stanford Undergraduate Physics Symposium. Bell found him the next morning, pale but glowing. I submitted it, Luis said simply. Bell blinked. You're not even enrolled. Luis shrugged. They asked for ideas, not IDs. Bell stared for a moment, then laughed. That's exactly what science needs. They sat under the tree by the cart, morning light slipping through branches. Luis told him about the letters, about his mother's classes, about the war. Bell listened without interrupting. At the end, he whispered, She would be proud. Luis looked toward the rising sun. I hope she knows. Somewhere in the light. The wind picked up. A page from the notebook fluttered loose, spinning briefly before resting at Bell's feet. He picked it up. It was the page with the quote. Bell read it aloud. Even a shadow can be evidence of light. He folded it gently, as if it were a prayer, and tucked it into his coat. The day of the symposium came with fog rolling low over the Stanford quad, wrapping the old brick buildings in a quiet veil. Luis walked slowly toward the physics hall, his shirt pressed, his notes clutched tightly, his heart loud enough to drown out the wind. He had never stepped into a room like this, where name tags held more weight than names, where lanyards seemed to outshine eyes. Rows of suited students murmured rehearsed pitches, their laptops aglow with simulations and citations. Posters lined the walls. Muon decay patterns in magnetic traps. Gravitational wave noise reduction via Bayesian modeling. And in the far corner, taped neatly to a whiteboard, was Luis's. The Coffee Cart Theorem, a local frame perspective on shadow-based time dilation. It stood out, not because it was polished, but because it was different. The diagrams were hand-drawn, the math handwritten. At the center, a photograph. Luis's chalked light cone traced on the pavement beneath the cart. He stood beside it, notebook in hand, waiting. The first to stop was a freshman. Are these real measurements, like outside? Luis nodded. Same spot every day for 3 weeks, same time intervals. I used projected light displacement to map relativistic curvature. The student blinked. That's wild. Then more came. A young postdoc asked about calibration. A doctoral candidate suggested modeling the curve using Lagrangian mechanics. Luis responded as best he could, always modest, often turning pages in his worn notebook for clarification. Some curious, some skeptical. A few professors nodded politely, until a voice, sharp, clipped, cut through the hum. This is a joke. The small crowd turned. Dr. Leland, senior faculty, known for his strict views on theoretical standards, stood staring at Luis's poster with thinly veiled disdain. A coffee vendor proposing an addition to special relativity? This is where we've arrived? Luis felt his throat tighten. His hands stayed at his sides. Leland continued. These projections lack rigorous boundary assumptions. Your coordinate frame is subjective. Your experiment uncontrolled. And this, he pointed to the diagram, this is child's play. Silence. One professor shifted uncomfortably. A student looked away. Then a voice from behind. And yet, Dr. Bell said, stepping forward, he spotted an elevation flaw in a 1974 peer-reviewed publication, which none of us corrected. Leland turned. This isn't about errors in old journals. It's about preserving standards. You know this. Yes, Bell replied. And standards must serve truth, not pedigree. The room tensed. Luis said nothing. He didn't have to. Bell stood beside him, one hand lightly on Luis's shoulder. Leland scoffed. In 10 years of symposiums, I've never seen something so unvetted make the roster. And in 10 years, Bell replied evenly, I haven't seen something so honest. More silence. Leland stepped back. I'll be filing a complaint. Do what you must, Bell said. Luis packed his things slowly after the session. The poster was now slightly wrinkled at the edges. He kept the photo, but left the display behind. Bell waited near the exit, silent. Outside, the fog had lifted. Students passed by laughing, unfazed. Luis and Bell walked toward the coffee cart. Luis looked down. Maybe he's right. Maybe I don't belong here. Bell sighed. Belonging is not a gift others give you. It's a claim you make. And I've seen you earn it, every morning, with chalk and patience. Luis hesitated. But it hurt. Not what he said. How many agreed silently. Bell nodded. Silence can cut deeper than words. But remember, so can yours. They reached the cart. Luis sat on the bench, watching sunlight cut through the remaining mist. In that light, he saw a boy again, himself, drawing a shadow on pavement, wondering if time could bend. He pulled out his notebook. The last page still held his mother's words. Even a shadow can be evidence of light. That night, he didn't sleep. He rewrote every note from the symposium, not to defend, to clarify, to understand more deeply. If resistance was part of the process, he would meet it, not with noise, but with quiet resolve and light. Luis rose early the next morning. The sting of the symposium hadn't faded, but something deeper stirred beneath the hurt, a clarity, a fire that could not be extinguished by a few words. He returned to the sidewalk near the cart with chalk in one hand and his notebook in the other. Bell found him kneeling in the morning light, already halfway through a massive sketch on the library's old brick wall. The Stanford maintenance staff had granted temporary permission. Bell's quiet strings pulled behind the scenes. The canvas was warm from the sun, wide and steady. Luis began with axes, space and time, X and CT. He drew Minkowski's spacetime in white chalk, the cone of causality in yellow, the mirror line of simultaneity in blue. Then he moved lower, sketching two figures. The twin who stays, he murmured, pointing to one, and the twin who travels. He drew arrows, world lines that bent slightly with curvature, their endpoints separated, visibly, achingly, one age greater than the other. He stepped back to look at it as a whole. The drawing spanned almost 8 feet. It was not only accurate, it was beautiful. Hand-drawn light cones that shimmered under the morning sun. Onlookers began to gather. Passers-by slowed, then stopped. Students on their way to class turned back. Elderly alumni visiting the campus leaned on canes and watched. Luis picked up a mirror, angled the sun's rays across the wall, letting real light cross the chalk lines. The cone lit up. The effect was subtle but profound. Time itself seemed to breathe. He stepped forward. "This isn't just theory," he said softly, now speaking to the growing circle. "This is what time looks like. When it stretches, when it folds, when someone leaves and someone stays." He picked up a piece of string, held it taut between two nails at the top of the diagram. "Imagine this as constant time. Now watch." He pulled one nail down, curving the string. "Relative motion bends this, and so what feels like a moment to one stretches for another." A silence fell. A student in physics whispered, "He just demonstrated time dilation without a single equation." An older man, gray beard, watery eyes, took off his cap. "That's my brother," he said aloud. "He never came back from Vietnam." Luis stepped forward gently. "Then you already understand the paradox." Bell stood at the back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His arms were crossed, but his expression was unguarded. Pride and awe. Luis turned to the crowd. "Some say time is an arrow. Others say it's a loop. But what if it's neither? What if it's a shadow, shaped by light, curved by presence, revealing not where we are, but who we are when we remember?" He walked slowly to the side of the wall and pointed to the origin. "This point, where both twins start, it's the same for all of us. Birth. But how we move, how we return, how much time we carry when we come back, that's different. Because we live in motion. We age through perspective." Someone asked softly, "So then what's the shape of time?" Luis smiled. "That's the question. I don't know. But maybe it's drawn in chalk. Maybe it's what we trace every day and don't see." More people arrived. A high school teacher brought her students. A professor of philosophy came and sat silently in the grass. Someone began filming. Not for attention, but to preserve. Luis picked up another color of chalk. Red. He traced smaller cones along the world lines of the traveling twin, demonstrating nested frames, local perspectives. Every observer carries their own cone, their own light path. What we see is only ever one intersection. He paused. "So when we say, 'I miss you,' what we really mean is, your cone doesn't intersect mine right now, but maybe it will again?" A tear slid down someone's cheek. No applause, no fanfare, just silence and understanding. Luis stepped back, put the chalk down, and wrote one final line beneath the diagram. "Even distance cannot hide the heart of time." Then he turned, stepped into the light, and walked back to the cart. He didn't need to win. He had already proven something greater. Behind him, a boy held his grandfather's hand. "I didn't get all of it," he whispered, "but I think it was about love." The grandfather nodded. "That's what time really is, son. It's just love, waiting." The sun rose higher, and the shadow of the cone lengthened gently across the wall. Still but never still, a memory, a proof, and a promise. The following week passed in quiet beauty. Luis still woke early, still brewed coffee, but something in his movements had slowed, softened. Perhaps it was the weight of what he had shared on the wall. Perhaps it was something deeper. His mother, Elena, had grown weaker. The days of conversation became days of stillness. She spent more time near the window now, the light always falling across her hands like a final benediction. Luis sat beside her often. Sometimes he would whisper about the wall diagram. Sometimes he would just hold her hand. Once, she stirred, smiled faintly, and said, "Time bends, doesn't it?" He nodded. "Yes, Mommy. It does." That night, she slept peacefully and did not wake. Louise found her at dawn, the quilt still pulled gently beneath her chin. Her face held no pain, only peace, like a shadow slowly fading into light. On the nightstand beside her, tucked into the pages of her old physics notebook, was a small envelope. On the front, "Para mi hijo." He opened it with shaking hands. Inside, written in her familiar hand, "Time does not separate us, mi hijo. It just bends. Where you go, I will follow. In memory, in motion, in light." Luis pressed the note to his heart. He didn't cry right away. He simply stood by the window and let the morning sun pass over his face. It was the same light that once danced through chalk and shadow, the same light that had traced time with him and with her. The funeral was simple. A few neighbors, Belle, 2 graduate students who had come every Saturday to watch the lessons at the cart. Luis said few words. He only read her final message aloud and laid her note beside a small framed copy of his diagram. That evening, he returned to his cart. He opened his notebook, cleared a space, and began typing. The tears came only when the screen lit up. Submission portal. Foundations of physics. He filled in the title. The coffee cart theorem, a local frame projection of time via environmental shadow analysis. Abstract. This paper presents a terrestrial analog of relativistic time dilation observed through real-time environmental shadow displacement. By projecting Minkowski spacetime onto 2-dimensional observational surfaces, this study proposes a local frame model grounded in daily light variance. The method offers both pedagogical and conceptual applications for visualizing general relativistic principles. He attached the diagrams, the images, the chalkwork, the letters, and before hitting submit, he paused, then typed, "For Elena, who first bent time with love." And with one breath, he sent it. Then, quietly, he sat down, let the sun set across the cart, and waited for the stars, because light was still moving, and so was he. Winter at Stanford came softly, the trees still golden from late autumn, the mornings draped in fog. A letter had arrived 2 weeks prior, bearing the seal of the university and the quiet weight of unexpected honor. Luis had been invited to present his work at the Stanford Winter Conference on theoretical physics. He reread the invitation 3 times. Then he walked to Belle's office in silence. The old professor was seated near the window, sorting through a pile of student essays. Luis stood in the doorway. "I didn't think they'd respond." Belle smiled without looking up. "You didn't write it to be accepted. You wrote it because it was true." Luis walked in slowly. "I don't have credentials. Or degrees. You have diagrams drawn in sunlight. You have local frames and elevation-corrected cones, and you have something the rest of us forgot." "What's that?" Belle looked up now, eyes warm. "Wonder." The morning of the conference, Luis wore a white shirt, the same brown sweater his mother had sewn a patch into last year, and shoes polished so much they looked wet. He carried no laptop, no pointer, only a box of chalk, a wooden board, a mirror, and a printed version of his paper. The room was grand, tiered seats, spotlights, 300 attendees, professors from MIT, Caltech, Princeton, rows of graduate students, cameras. At the front sat the panel, 7 of the most accomplished physicists in North America. Their names had once seemed distant, now engraved on placards facing him. Belle sat quietly in the audience near the back. His presence was still grounding. Luis took the stage, adjusted the mirror, placed it gently on a ledge where the sunlight pooled through a tall stained glass window. He stepped forward. No slides, just breath. My name is Luis Herrera. I sell coffee outside this university. Every morning I watch light fall on pavement, and every morning I ask it what time is. A few chuckles, nervous but not mocking. Luis continued. This talk won't contain simulations or tensor fields, but it will show you the shape of time, not on paper but on the sidewalk. He held up the board. It was his chalk drawing, recreated, polished, but still bearing the humanity of hand. Worldlings, cones, a projection of twin motion across local frames. He picked up a flashlight, switched it on, and angled it across the board. The traveling twin moves through time differently, not because their clock lies, but because their path bends. If light is constant, then shadow is honest, and what bends the shadow reveals the shape of motion. He moved the mirror slowly. The beam of light changed direction, casting the cone across the wall. Now this is a simple analog, a child's model perhaps, but it maps the central question. Does time pass the same for all? And if not, how can we see it? He turned to the audience. I saw it in chalk, in trees, in my mother's breath. Silence held the room like glass. Luis continued. We teach relativity with equations, but we feel it with absence. A son gone to war, a lover waiting by the window. These are not metaphors. They're data. They're real frames. Local, personal, and measurable. He paused, and they are just as valid. The panel shifted. One leaned forward, another wrote something down. Luis lowered the light, stepped away from the board. I didn't come here to correct equations. I came to trace them in the world we live in. Then came the question. A panelist, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, lifted a finger. Mr. Herrera, he said, you speak with conviction. But what gives you the authority to teach us about time? A long pause. Luis smiled gently. I don't teach, he said. I just brew coffee long enough to watch time move. Silence. Then something happened. One of the panelists, a stern woman from Toronto, stood and walked to the chalkboard. She picked up a piece of chalk and, without a word, added a line to his diagram, a small world line diverging slightly. She nodded, then sat down. The audience breathed again. Not applause, but something deeper. Consent. Recognition. Luis bowed slightly, gathered his things, and walked off the stage. Belle was waiting in the hallway. You answered better than I ever could, Luis chuckled. I had practice, hundreds of cups. Belle placed a hand on his shoulder. She'd be proud. Luis looked out the window. Time doesn't separate us, it just bends. And from the far end of the corridor the sun stretched through the glass, casting a quiet shadow across the tiled floor, one long arc curving gently toward the door. The letter came with a seal. Stanford, embossed in gold. Inside, a formal scholarship offer, full ride, mentorship track, housing, stipend. A dream, a recognition. Luis folded the paper once, then again, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in a wooden box beside his mother's final note. He had already chosen. Weeks later, under a sky that felt wider than any lecture hall, Luis stood barefoot on Guatemalan soil. The air smelled of dry corn, distant rain, and wood smoke. He was home. Not the kind of home made of walls, but of memory, of return. In a one-room school built from salvaged planks and painted tin, Luis placed 3 things on a rough wooden table: a mirror, a cracked coffee mug, and a piece of chalk. Children gathered slowly, some barefoot, some shy, all wide-eyed. "Hoy," Luis said softly. "Vamos a ver el tiempo." They giggled. One boy whispered, "Pero el tiempo no se ve." Luis smiled. "Eso es lo que nos enseñaron. Pero ¿y si se puede?" He angled the mirror. The sunlight streamed through the doorway, casting a long line across the dirt floor. "See that?" he said in Spanish. "That's time. And this," he held up the chalk, "is how we learn to trace it." They drew together. Light cones on the wall, world lines between trees. They timed shadows using the steaming mug, watched the sun rise over equations carved in dust. He taught them relativity not through math, but through movement. "Everything that moves," he said, "bends time just a little, and everything we love bends us." He called the school La Escuela del Tiempo. A year passed. One morning, an old man arrived, a pale traveler with tired eyes and a cane. The children called out to Luis, who stepped into the sun and squinted. "Dr. Bell," he said, nearly whispering. Bell smiled, nodded. "I thought I'd see your chalk one more time." They embraced, quietly. Bell sat in the shade, watching the children map constellations using string and mirrors. One girl explained the twin paradox using her baby brother's nap times. Bell laughed so hard he coughed. Luis brought him coffee, thick, sweet. "You're still teaching with caffeine?" Bell asked. Luis nodded. "Best carrier of light and patience I've found." On the wall of the classroom, shaded from the heat, was a line written in Spanish and English. "Time is a cup of coffee. If you're patient enough, every wonder will appear." Bell stared at it for a long time. "I used to think time was math," he said. Luis nodded. "I used to think it was a barrier." They sat quietly, watching the sun shift shadows across the courtyard. Bell spoke again. "Do they understand what you're teaching?" Luis sipped. "They don't need to understand yet. They just need to feel curious. Time will do the rest." That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Bell stood to leave. Luis walked him to the road. "I never said thank you," Luis said. Bell smiled. "You did, every morning, in silence." He handed Luis a folded letter, his own submission to Foundations of Physics. "Published," he said simply. Luis opened it after Bell left. Inside, the printed journal, his theorem, the light cones, the sidewalk, the coffee cart. He didn't cry, he just smiled. And the next morning, he picked up the chalk again. Time had bent and returned home.